My psychopath brother wanted me to break up with my fiance so I could set her up with him, but when I said no, he went insane. He sent me fake screenshots of her cheating and drunkenly crashed our wedding rehearsal, so I cut him and my whole family who supported him off. A little over 5 years ago, my brother Turk started dating Maria, and 3 months in, they set me up with her best friend Jen. A few months into Jen and I dating, I walked in on her and Turk doing it in my bed. I immediately called Maria and we confronted Jen and Turk. They dumped us, and 2 days later they started dating each other. Throughout the next little while, Maria and I started talking, and 4 months later, we officially started dating. 6 months after that, Turk found out Jen was cheating on him, and so he started begging Maria for another chance. He showed up to her house unannounced, and I cut contact with him after he tried breaking into her house while she was home alone. Fast forward to now, Maria and I are getting married. My parents were invited, but recently my mom called me and pressured me to invite Turk. She asked me not to break the family over silly drama. I told her Turk's not coming, but she refused to see my point. I eventually uninvited her and my dad. Not even minutes later, Turk started blowing up my phone. I ignored him at first, but as the days went on, his texts turned into calls, and curiosity got the better of me. Part of me thought maybe he wanted to make amends, so after stewing on it for a while, I agreed to meet him for coffee. I figured it couldn't hurt to hear what he had to say. If nothing else, maybe I'd get some closure. The cafe was quiet when I got there, and my brother was already sitting at a table waiting. I sat down, ready to let him speak first, expecting an apology, but he didn't apologize. He didn't even mention the past. Instead, he went straight to what he really wanted. He said I needed to break up with my fiance. I was shocked. He went on to say that she was still in love with him and that I was just a rebound for her. He admitted that he was wrong in cheating on her and wanted her back. I found what he said comical. The gall of this guy. He had to be kidding me. He said that she belonged to him and that I had my fun with her, but now it was time to step aside. The laughter that I once had quickly turned into anger. After everything he'd done, now he was trying to take her away from me. I stood up, not willing to entertain this any longer. I told him that he'd lost it, but before I could walk away, he grabbed my arm and said I'd regret this if I didn't do what he said. I snatched my arm away and told him he was just upset because my ex cheated on both of us, and now he's missing what he can't have. There would be nothing to separate me and Julia. He said, she'll come back to me eventually, you'll see. I walked out without another word. The person who had destroyed my last relationship was now trying to destroy this one too. When I got home, I told my fiancée what had happened. She was shocked, but not entirely surprised. I always knew he was unstable, she said, but I didn't think he'd stoop this low. We decided to move on, ignoring my brother's craziness and focusing on the wedding. For the next few weeks, everything seemed to go back to normal. We were finalizing wedding plans, tasting cakes, picking out flowers, and trying to enjoy the happiest times of our lives. But then the texts started. At first, they were just random anonymous messages claiming my fiancé was cheating on me. I ignored them. It was easy to write off as some troll or prankster, but then they became more specific. Screenshots of fake conversations were sent to me, showing her supposedly flirting with other men. The messages were so obviously doctored, but it still rattled Julia. She didn't like the idea of someone out there trying to sabotage our relationship. It didn't take me long to suspect who was behind it. I confronted my brother and told him I knew that he was the one sending the texts. He, of course, denied everything, acting like he had no idea what I was talking about. I didn't believe him, but without proof, what could I do? The texts started coming late at night, sometimes after midnight, and they became more frequent. By the third night, it was getting harder to ignore. Then, the calls started. At first, they'd hang up the moment we answered, but one night, around 1 a.m., I picked up, and this time, the person didn't hang up. You're going to regret marrying her, a voice whispered to me. It was low and hard to recognize. They said that Julia would ruin my life, and I'd be sorry. I hung up, feeling sick. My fiancée was sitting up in bed, her face pale. She knew that it was my brother by the look on my face. The calls kept coming every night. That's when we'd had enough. We took everything, the texts and the call logs, to the police, hoping they could help. But after an hour of explaining, the officer shook his head. He said without more evidence, there's not much we can do, and offered that we could try changing our numbers and blocking them, but they can't track anonymous numbers easily. This is harassment, but it's not enough for them to take action yet. So, that night, we changed our numbers. For a few days, things were quiet. I thought maybe we were finally free from it. But then, a week later, new anonymous accounts started messaging us on social media. The first anonymous message appeared on Instagram. Its tone was familiar, accusing, and venomous, similar to the texts we had been receiving. At first, we tried to ignore it, but when my fiancé started receiving them too, each new message set us more on edge. We blocked the the accounts, hoping that would put an end to it. But within hours, new ones would spring up, each more aggressive than the last. The messages followed the same pattern: accusations of betrayal, warnings about our relationship, and threats that we couldn't quite trace to anyone specifically, but were impossible to ignore. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. My fiance's anxiety grew, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. Neither of us could escape it. The constant notifications, the chilling, anonymous threats, the feeling of being watched. It was suffocating. We tried to carry on with wedding planning, but it was hard to focus. We realized we couldn't keep living like this. The decision was made to deactivate our social media accounts entirely. We needed to focus on our relationship and the wedding without the constant bombardment of threats. Once our accounts were deactivated, the silence was immediate. Without the flood of notifications, we felt a calm we hadn't experienced in weeks. The quiet allowed us to reconnect, to focus on what really mattered. We spent the next few days immersed in wedding plans, appreciating the simplicity of being unplugged. The absence of social media was freeing. The messages had stopped, but the people behind them, my family, hadn't. As the wedding day approached, I knew their pranks weren't over. Just days before the wedding, something far worse happened. My fiancé had spent months picking out the perfect dress. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of. But one evening, we came home to find the dress completely destroyed. Someone had broken into our house and poured black ink all over it. The fabric was beyond repair. My fiancé was heartbroken, and I was livid. I checked the security footage from our front door, and there, in the dead of night, was a figure sneaking away. It was hard to make out clearly, but the person looked an awful lot like my mother. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew it was her. My mom had never approved of the wedding, but this was a new low. I confronted my parents the next day and showed them the footage. They both denied any involvement and acted offended that I'd even suggest such a thing. I knew better. I knew my family, and they were capable of anything to get their way. At that point, I realized my parents were just as toxic as my brother. They weren't just passively enabling him, they were actively trying to ruin my life. But with the wedding just days away, I couldn't afford to get caught up in another fight. My fiancé and I scrambled to find a new dress, and by some miracle, we managed to get a replacement just in time. The night before the wedding, we had our rehearsal dinner. Everything was falling into place, and I was finally starting to relax. It had been a roller coaster, but I was about to marry the love of my life, and nothing else mattered. That is, until my brother showed up uninvited. He stumbled into the rehearsal dinner, drunk and reeking of alcohol. I saw him from across the room. He slurred his words, and his eyes were bloodshot. Before I could stop him, he started shouting across the room. "She's a gold digger!" he yelled, and pointed a shaky finger at my fiancé. The whole room went silent. My fiancé's face turned pale. I could feel the rage building inside me, but I knew I had to keep calm. I wasn't going to let him ruin this moment. I told him he had to leave, but he didn't stop. He started spewing insult after insult, calling her names, saying that our marriage was a joke. He was out of control, completely off the rails. My parents were there too, standing behind him. And you know what? They weren't stopping him. They were egging him on, nodding along like they agreed with every word. They yelled, saying our marriage wouldn't last, and that Julia would take everything I had and leave me just like she left my brother. I saw red. I stormed across the room, grabbed my brother by the arm, and dragged him outside. He kept fighting me, yelling all the way. I shoved him toward the door, telling him to leave and never come back. "You're not welcome at the wedding. You're not welcome in my life." I spat at him. He stumbled backward, falling into the bushes, still yelling. I turned to my parents, hoping they'd at least have the decency to leave quietly. But instead, my mom crossed her arms, glaring at me like I was the one in the wrong. Before leaving, my mom said I was making a huge mistake and reminded me they wouldn't be there to clean up the mess when everything fell apart. Without another word, I turned my back on them and walked back inside. The damage was done. The rehearsal was in chaos, my fiancé was in tears, and everyone else was staring at me like they didn't know what to say. I felt like my entire world was crumbling around me, but I refused to let them win. That night, I sat with my fiancé, holding her as she cried. She kept asking why they hated her so much, why they couldn't just let us be happy. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I had to protect her from their toxicity. The next day, we were hours away from our wedding, and I had to make sure nothing would stand in the way of our happiness. Early that morning, I got a phone call from one of the staff members at our wedding venue. He sounded hesitant as he told me what had happened. happened. He said my brother and parents were there, and they tried to bribe them into canceling the wedding. They said they offered him almost $5,000 to cancel the wedding, but he didn't take it. I told him I was grateful that he let me know. I didn't even hang up the phone. I dropped everything and drove straight to the venue. When I got there, my brother and parents were still arguing with the staff, trying to convince them to ruin my wedding. I walked up to them and asked, what the hell did they think they were doing? My mom turned to me saying, we're trying to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life. They've definitely gone too far. I threatened to have them arrested if they didn't leave that instant. They looked at me like I was the crazy one. My brother tried to argue, saying he was just trying to help me see the truth, but I wasn't listening. I was done. I didn't care what they had to say anymore. I said, get out, and for the first time in a long time, my mother looked shocked. She hadn't expected me to stand up to them like this. I was done being their punching bag. They left. I guess they finally realized that they had lost. As they walked away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was like I could finally breathe again. The wedding went ahead as planned. We had extra security to make sure my family didn't try to crash it, but everything went smoothly. My fiance and I exchanged our vows in front of our friends and were surrounded by people who actually loved and supported us. It was the happiest day of my life, despite everything that had happened. Julia was the most beautiful person I had ever seen, and I was excited to finally start our lives together. As I stood there, holding my wife's hand, I knew I had made the right decision. Cutting out my family was hard, but it was necessary. They had crossed every line imaginable, and there was no coming back from that. In the end, I realized family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, support you, and love you unconditionally. My brother and parents had shown me that they were never going to be those people, and that was okay. I had my wife, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally move forward.